Hello, everyone. Welcome to Zobrio University's webinar on customizing columns and financial statements. Today we have Chuck Hayes, the Director of Application Services here at Zobrio, to lead the webinar. If you have any questions, please leave them in the chat, which is located at the bottom of your screen, and we will go over all questions at the end. Thank you, and I'll now hand it over to Chuck.
Thank you very much, Colleen. And would you just verify that you can see my screen okay? I just did the resharing thing. So.
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much. Well, again, my name is Chuck Hayes. I'm going to be your tour guide today. We're going to talk about how to customize columns in financial statements in Financial Edge. And I think you'll see that there's a lot of flexibility if you've not already explored it. And basically, we're going to go through a process of just gradually building a financial statement and looking at different settings and how they impact the process. So for example, how do I report fund activity? Well, of course, that's pretty much a given that you're reporting funds. The question is, well, do I want to rearrange it on the reports in some way, shape, or form? We'll also be looking at, how do you compare budgets to actuals? And what about specific time frames? And, what if I want to use formulas? So I'll be doing all of these kind of at the same time with some of these settings. Some settings actually overlap on all of these. So we'll take a look at each of them in some way, shape, or form. So I'm using a real simple sample database that I have with activity. And I'm going to be focusing pretty much on the month of January 2020, just to give a sense of, seeing some actual numbers in front of us. But I'll be focusing on the settings that you would use for everything from, a specific period to some other time frame like year to date, or even comparisons between them. So we are assuming that you have some basic working knowledge of the reports inside the Financial Edge. In this case, I am pulling an example from financial statements. So just to be clear about where those are located. So if I go to reports the long way, and then to financial statements, and then to income statements, this is where you can create one or more parameter files that will construct a financial statement of some kind. And this happens to represent the type of statement that's perhaps the most complex of the settings that exist inside the Financial Edge reporting. And we're going to focus specifically on the columns themselves. So let me just do a quick orientation because I'm going to mention a few other settings. So let me just refresh your memory or orient you to a few setups in general for either income statements or balance sheets. Anything in this section works pretty much the same way. So typically the general tab is more about, including or excluding activity, if there isn't any activity. We also have this thing called the visual chart organizer. I'll talk briefly about that in just a little bit. Of course, there are filters where you can restrict, say, a particular fund or some other segment in your situation. This particular database has 3 segments to the chart of accounts. There's a fund, and then there's an account code, the natural, code, if you will, like expenses of some sort, and then a department. So any of these settings can work with any combination you have in your chart of accounts. And then, of course, we'll be talking about columns. I'll orient you to that as well, including this multi-column heading. And then lastly, there's the Format tab. And what's interesting about the Format tab in general in the Financial Edge is that there usually are settings in the detail section on the left and the sort section that could impact not only the look and feel of the report, but whether or not certain pieces of information show up. So I'm going to point out a couple of those settings that are relevant to how they work with columns as we go along. But let's focus first on the columns themselves. And I think a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I'm going to go back and forth between this setup file, the parameter file, and a preview of a report. And I think by doing that, it's helpful to say, okay, let's look at setting X. We'll focus on one setting, we'll make the change, and then we'll look at how it impacts the report. And so that way, as we go along, you get a sense of gradually building a report, but also immediately seeing the impact. So this report is pretty much when I just start a brand new report, new income statement, what does the system do? About the only thing I did was specify the time frame, which I will show you in just a little bit. But let me just kind of show you what's going on here. So obviously we have groupings on the left in bold. I'll talk about where they came from in just a moment. Then we have a list of account numbers. And then we have one column in this example, which currently says actual, which we assume to be financial activity, but how do we really know that that's true? So let's talk about the components of what you're seeing, because that directly ties to the settings that we're going to look at. So the left-hand side of the report, where you see those groupings, that is controlled by what's called a visual chart organizer. And strictly speaking, that's not something that our topic on customizing columns is necessarily addressing. But I do want to point it out because those groupings are arbitrary based on your chart of accounts. If we just focus on that piece with the headings on the left, I'll just take 1 minute to show you. So the visual chart organizer is controlled on this first tab. Everybody's database has one that's called default. And all that simply does is create groupings on the left that say expenses. And then at some point, by the way, I only have expenses in this example, but then revenue. And if it's a balance sheet, assets and liabilities. That's controlled by the VCO, and the default one just does the generic thing. What I like to point out is that you can also do groupings that represent the way you like to do roll-ups of reporting. So for example, in this sample database, I have a group called salaries and related expenses and contract service expense and non-personnel expenses. And the visual chart organizer allows you to do this leveling. So if I drop this down to, I believe level 2 is what I want. When I go to preview, I'll just see the groupings and I don't see the account numbers anymore. Now I realize I'm a little outside our stated topic, but this does go to the ways in which you present the columns of information. It's not just about the columns, it's also about the VCO and what settings you use. So I'm going to go back to my previous setting of level 4. Okay, now let's focus again on the columns. So you'll notice that there's a column for the account number. So forget the headings, that's the VCO. And there's a column for the description of the account. And then there's a column for actual. So let's correlate those 3 columns to the setup process. So on the tab known as columns, you'll see 3 rows. One says account number, then account description, and then actuals. Well, those correspond to the physical columns on the report. So when I talk about a row on this columns tab, it's actually a column on the report. Now, you have to be a little careful when you get further into the settings. It's very tempting. I noticed a lot of folks over the years as I've trained them or talked to them, they'll immediately check this box hide, which defeats the purpose because I want to show the account number. So if you want to dive further into the settings for a column, I have a tip for you. Always click first on the square on the far left of the grid. In this case, it's numbered. So I'm going to click on the number 1. Then I can either do a right click to open or the open column button above or a double click. So I'm going to go ahead and open. So now we're getting into additional complexity that's going to get even more complex as I cycle through the columns. So let me reposition this so you can kind of see everything together. So you'll notice that there are several areas to this first tab depending on, that relate to the column that I'm trying to define. So you'll see something called the column heading, and then on the left, you get into things like type and display. And on the upper right, then we deal with width and settings like that. So in this case, the first column is for the account number. That was automatically added by the system when I just said, hey, I want a new financial statement. I'm going to use the button in the upper right to do next column in just a moment, but you'll notice that this is where I can do the descriptors. So the account number, that kind of thing. So I'm going to go ahead and do next. And now I'm dealing with the account description. And then when I switch to the actual, things will change quite a bit. So now I've added 2 more tabs. So let's dive a little bit more closely at what we're seeing. And we're going to take each of these like kind of one at a time and do the whole before and after so you can see exactly what's going on. So this top area, the input box, if you will, called column heading, You can do more than one row, and you can do what's called a formula field. So like, okay, well, what's that all about, and how does that help me? So we've got the word actual, which you saw when I did the preview before. Okay, that kind of makes sense. But one of my bugaboos about financial statements is I want a heading that tells me the time frame for that particular report. And I don't want someone typing in the date, because that doesn't give me confidence that the information that I'm seeing is actually the time frame that they say it is. So to get around that, we have something called formula fields. So these formula fields will dynamically render the dating of the report information based on this second tab in the upper left called date range, which I'll get to in just a moment. So let's go ahead and talk about how to add the dynamic dates here, the formula fields, and then we'll look at the date settings, and then we'll trace that to what we see in the preview. The first thing I want to mention is that this input box is a little counterintuitive, like you don't use the enter key. I want to add another row, but if I press enter, I'm going to close the entire dialog box. Instead, you have to use a keystroke combination. So I'm going to position the cursor at the end of the word actual, the end of that row. Then I'm going to hold down the control key and press enter, and that opens up a new row. You might be able to see that my cursor is blinking. So now I'm going to click the button for start date, and that inserts a formula field. It has the little braces around the phrase start date. That means it's a formula. So then I want to add one more row. So I'm going to go back in, have to click a couple times, don't mess anything up. Go to the end of the row, do control enter again. I'll put in a little hyphen, a space, and then I'll say end date. So this column heading will say this is actuals. The system will dynamically render the beginning date of the time frame and the ending date of the time frame. Let's look at the time frame. Then we'll go to preview, and then I'll come back and review the settings. So the date range column, which I'm going to talk more extensively about after we go to preview, right now it's set to do last fiscal period, which would be January of 2020. So I'm going to click OK just to preserve those settings, resave what I did with the blue diskette icon in the upper right. Now let's notice the immediate change in the column heading. I'm going to go back to preview. Let me do a quick magnification. Voila. Now you'll see that the column heading is showing the dates that I selected. So I said last fiscal period, which is kind of nice because when I get to March, it'll automatically become February. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But notice that I did not type in 1/1/2020. I let the system use the formula field start date, and now it dynamically renders it, and Chuck can be confident that the dollars he's seeing in that column are actually from January of 2020, okay? So I can put dates into any of my column headings that are dynamically rendered. Now, going back to what we were viewing earlier, let me go back into this particular actuals column and just mention a few more things, and then we'll talk about the date. So in the lower right area, we call this the formula area, like how does the system determine the information that's showing up in the column? And you'll see that there's a formula called actuals. We'll talk about the other formulas on the left related to the budget, because we do want to look at how to add budgets. But you'll see that there are formulas for budgets. You can also do formulas. So if you are doing encumbrance accounting, let's say you've got purchase orders or something and you are encumbering certain activity, even if you do it manually, you could create a column that shows the actuals and then a column that shows the encumbrances and a column that combines them. You'll see there are formula fields for that as well. Let's focus a little bit more on the date range. I want to go back to some of the other settings that are available. So let's start at the, you'll see there are a lot of different choices here. So let me just orient you to those. We've got the specific fiscal periods, which is where I want to go in a moment. But if you can do an entire year, you can deal with last fiscal period, that kind of stuff. One of my favorites is at the end, which I'll talk about fiscal year to last fiscal period. But let's start with the basics, specific fiscal periods. So this setting exists in a lot of reports and when it comes to dates. But what you're able to do is use a range of specific periods from your fiscal year. I just want to issue a caution about how you set up dates. It's not so much about what you want to accomplish. Obviously, you need to know, you decide what dates you want to see. But I want to encourage you to set up the columns so that they are always dynamically rendered and you don't have to keep changing dates. So let's do a few scenarios here and just talk about dates in general. As you saw earlier, I did last fiscal period because I know I've got activity right there in my little sample database. We'll do year to date in just a little bit, and this database actually it starts January 1, every fiscal year, so it's going to be the same period. But I just want to encourage you to try to use these user-friendly dates, everything from this period to last period to this year to last year, this month, etc. That way you can avoid having to, like I said, just type in dates every time, because that just gets annoying to have to keep changing it. If you do need to go down the road of having some versions of the report that need highly specific date combinations, at least create a version of the report that uses the user-friendly dates, and then create another version that is hard-coded with dates if you have to type in the dates, so that you're not constantly going back and forth in just one report file. You can get it set up really nice and then create maybe 3 or 4 copies of it, but then modify dates like this one has to be a certain time frame, etc. We'll talk about the relative date range in just a little bit. But I'm going to go back to my previous setting of last fiscal period. And then, like I said, I'm going to get into doing a year-to-date comparison as well. But let's just start with the basics here. You'll notice on the last tab, there is a filters tab. So I want to address that because one of our bullet points was, reporting by fund. Now, in this example, right now I just have activity in Fund 1. But let's say that you've got a variety of different funds, we'll assume that, and you want to have columns that show funds separately. And maybe you're doing a roll-up like I did with salaries and expenses. So you're not seeing individual account numbers. You just want to do a roll-up, and you just want to see how that looks across various different funds. Well, let me explain how the filters work. So there are filters for the report itself. So if I wanted to do, funds 1, 3, and 5, whatever my numbers are, then I would make sure the filters for the report encompass all of them. So in this case, it's just set to show every fund. And then in the filters tab for a particular column, then I can specify that this column is only going to be Fund 1 if I wanted to do that. And if that's true, then back on the general tab, you would probably have to type in for the column heading that this is Department 1, or excuse me, Fund 1's actual. So you can use the column filters for things like funds, or even like in my example, I could use them for departments. So if I just wanted to see Department 1, then I could just show that as a filter at the column level. Now, what I did in this report for my demonstration today is I specified to only look at Department 1 right now, but I'm just pointing out that you can use the filters for other purposes within that. All right, so let's go back to the issue of actuals, budgets, and time frames. So right now we know that I've got a column for actuals for last period. Well, what if I also want to compare the actuals for last period to the budget? And let's assume for argument's sake that you have period-specific budgets, because I'll show you year-to-date in a moment, it would work the same way. So rather than retype everything that I just did, including all that work on the start date and end date, there is a feature called Repeat Column, which means take everything you see here on those 3 tabs, create a new column, in this case, column number 4, with all the same settings, then I can modify it to be the budget information. So I'm going to go ahead and use the Repeat Column button. And just a comment, visually, you're seeing that the title bar says column 4, which is what I want. In the background, you don't yet see column 4 listed as a row because I haven't officially saved it yet. So we're going to modify column 4 to be the budget. So all I'm going to do is change the word actual in the heading to budget. I did spell that correctly, good. And then in the lower right, I'm going to change the formula field. So I'm going to clear that out with the clear button down the lower right corner. You'll notice that there are 3 different options for budget: original, adjusted, and budget adjustment. Let me just quickly comment on that. That's a good topic for another session. But in Financial Ed, you can do a process known as finalizing the budget. Just think of it as a line in the sand for tracking changes. So let's say you have an approved budget, and maybe once a year you allow revisions, or the board approves them. So I could finalize the budget after everything's initially approved. And then 9 months later, maybe we do a revision or whatever terminology you use. And then I can add those changes, and the system will track the changes separately. So the terminology is the original budget is the budget up to the point of finalization, the time when I finalize. The budget adjustments are the changes after finalization. And then the adjusted budget is the result of those changes. Now, if I've never finalized the budget, then original and adjusted are the same because there are $0 of budget adjustments. I usually recommend that even if you're not using the finalization feature, go ahead and always use the adjusted budget formula field for your budget, because that way you can be confident that if you ever do finalize, you'll get the latest and greatest in terms of what's in the scenario. In this sample database, our budget scenario is called final. So notice I was prompted to select the right one. And now the formula field on the right says adjusted budget from the final scenario. I've kept the same time range. So let me click OK, save what I did, go back to preview. Take just a little bit longer when it's pulling budget information. And now I'm starting to see budget information. All right, let's go a little bit further. What if I want to show a variance? So we mentioned in the setup, the little bullet points, talking about formulas between columns. Well, we have a really cool one. Now, right now, I'm only showing expenses, but there's a really interesting formula field. So before I go back to it, I just want to do a little illustration here. So typically, and you may not want what I'm about to say, but I would say over the years, maybe 75, 80% want this, so I'll mention it. So typically, if I am comparing revenue to budget, if I have a revenue shortfall, then I want to show the variance as a negative number. So that would be the actuals minus the budget, if you will, to get a negative variance for revenue shortfalls. But if I've underspent expenses, I usually want to show the underspending, the shortfall, if you will, as a positive variance. So that would be budget minus actuals in my example. So you'll notice that sometimes the math is different for revenue and expenses. So the way we can accommodate that is with a special formula field. So if I go back to columns, I want to go ahead and do another repeat, which I can do from this view as well. So I'm going to select column 4. I'm going to repeat it. I'm going to open up what is now column 5. And this will be my variance column. So let's just do a variance for dollars. You can also do percentages. I'm going to clear out my formula field in the lower right. And if we look on the left, we now have more choices because I now have an official budget column. So the formula field known as Get Favorable Unfavorable will show a negative variance if the revenue is below budget, but show a positive variance if expenses are below budget. So I'll bring over Get Favorable Unfavorable. It normally wants actuals first and budget second, so that works for me, 3 and 4. Click OK, go back, preview. And assuming I didn't forget something, we'll have the fact that we've been underspending and we have some money left. There we go. There is another formula field that I'm not going to bother with right now, but you can also add, let me go back into this one. There's a formula field called Get Percent Variance. So it also does the math between actuals and budgets. That one you just have to reverse. So the budget comes first and the actuals second, but that's something you can experiment with. So you could add a percentage variance as well. Okay, now if you think about it, I could do the same thing for year to date, and that is simply a matter of changing the time frames. So in the interest of the time I have for today, let's just, I'm going to speed this up just a little bit. Let's say, you know what, I just want to show last period as my actuals, my first column. And I don't want to bother comparing that to budget. Instead, I want to show a year-to-date column of actuals, and then I want the budget compared to the year-to-date, because that's a common request that I get. So I'm going to go ahead and repeat this actuals, and I'm going to change this actuals, and don't worry about the red print on the right. I'm going to change this actuals to be year-to-date, and I really like this last setting, fiscal year to last fiscal period. So the idea is, and I didn't mention this earlier, but typically most folks take at least 5 to 10 days to close the month after the month ends. So when January is over, it might take me to about February 5th, February 10th to close out, whatever the time frame is. So typically, I'm not running a January financial until February anyway. So why not set it to last fiscal period? If I'm doing year to date, fiscal year to date, then do fiscal year to last fiscal period. So I'll go ahead and do that. So I already took care of that. Notice that in this sample database, they're actually one and the same. But then I can change my adjusted budget formula field to work with what is now, that one's good, but I need to change the time frame, sorry. So I'll change the date range for this to also be either fiscal year to last fiscal period, or some folks just do the entire fiscal year, depending on how you're doing your budgets in the system. But then I want to change my formula field to focus on 4 and 5 instead of 3 and 4. So for that, I can certainly edit, but usually what I go ahead and do is just clear it out and just start over again. So I want to compare the actuals in 4 to the budget in 5. All right, so let me just address this columns issue. When you see red on the right, it doesn't mean that we're angry, as in seeing red. It just means that we need a little bit less space for the columns, and typically 3/4 of an inch works fine. So I'm using this previous column button at the top to quickly change my column width. Okay, let's take a look at that, and then I'll show you one more little setting that I think is kind of cool. And then we will have looked at most of the major settings that are available to us. All right. There we go. So I realize my dates are pretty much the same because of my little sample database. But now I'm seeing a column for actuals, then actuals year to date. I should have changed that column heading, which I'll do. But the other thing we can do, we can create another row above these columns that will distinguish last period from year to date. So let me show you that setting. So first, I'm going to go back into this actuals, and I'm going to change this one to say YTD actuals, and then I'll do the same thing for the budget. Oops, I'm not clicking correctly. YTD, and then one more. Probably should have done this to begin with. So you'll see that. But what I want to show you is this next tab on the report known as MultiColumn Headings. So what I want is another row above that says that column 3 is last period, and then 4, 5, and 6 are fiscal year to date. So in this MultiColumn Headings, you create rows for each. They become one single row on the report, but I break it up into sections. So the one section will be the one for column 3. So I'll call this last period, or if you prefer last month, you can certainly do that. So that was column 3. So I just do start 3 and 3. And then I want to do fiscal year to date, and I want that to span across 4 through 6. So again, going back, so this above this, I'll see last period, and then above these 3, I'll see fiscal year to date. Save, go to preview. There we go. Cool. So just to recap, I have full control over the columns. You can also switch to landscape and get more real estate for all your columns. I can do actuals, I can do budget, I can do comparisons. If you want some other ratio, when you're doing that formula field area, there are options to do like column 4 minus column 3. You can do that as well. I'll briefly point out that. And then one last thing that I sometimes get a request for, then we'll close up. Sometimes people want to go back a full year. So they'll say, I want last period, whatever that is. So it could be now it's January, but 6 months from now it's some other date. But then I want that period compared to exactly 12 months earlier, whatever that period is. And you might run into a situation where it's a little hard to tell the system 1 year ago last period. That's really what we're saying. So instead, you can do what's called a relative range. And I'll briefly point out that setting. So in my example, what I'm saying is, I'm still fine with having last period, but I want to go ahead and I'm going to insert one more column just to kind of show you what that looks like. So I'm going to add one more column here that I want to represent a year ago last period. So we don't have an option in the date range that says a year ago last period. Instead, we have what's called relative range. And the question becomes, what am I relative to? So this column, column 4, is going to be decided, the date range, based on another column. So it's relative to another column. So the base column, the one that's the starting point of the math of the period, is number 3. So start with column 3, and then go back, a minus symbol, go back 12 fiscal periods. So if my original range is 1/1/2020, and I want to go back, I guess I want to go back 11 years, but if I want to go back 12 periods, then I would tell the system to go back 12. It's just not rendering correctly. It is 12. We'll get it right. Let me click OK. It resynced correctly this time. The header wasn't correctly showing the math, so I wanted to resync it. But see how it now says 1/1/2019 to 1/31/2019, and I didn't type in those dates. So again, it was relative, go back 12 months compared to column 3. So now we'll get some zeros in the activity in this database right now. But the point is, you could do that for any of your time frames. So pick a base period, make another period relative to that, and then I could fix the column, the extra row at the top, to show 1 year ago for column 4, and then shift fiscal year to date over for what is now, 5, 6, and 7. So there you go. So we've taken a look at the settings relative to columns in terms of filtering by, different organizational entities or things like that, like departments or funds. But also we can do different date ranges, relative dates. We can put dynamic dates in the heading. The system has a lot of flexibility to it specifically for these financial statements. And I would simply recommend to you first, plan out on a piece of paper exactly what you want. How many columns do you want? What's each one showing? What's the basis for the column? Write it all out, sketch it all out. Then it's pretty easy to go ahead and set up each of the individual columns. So that concludes our demonstration for today. I'm going to hang around just for a little bit longer in case you have any questions. Feel free to use the chat window to go ahead and type in those questions, and I'll be glad to do my best to answer them. But thank you so much for coming today. And we are recording this session, and we'll also send out a link to it.